All right, everybody, welcome back. So let's go ahead and continue on advancing forward. Okay, once again, don't forget about the Slack channel. Have some good conversations going on over in Slack, and that's the primary way that we prefer you ask the questions. I am monitoring the Zoom sessions as well. So if you have questions and you don't have access, or you're kind of mobile and you're not logged into Slack, feel free to throw them inside of Zoom, and I'll try to address them there. But the problem is quite often we don't have enough time to be able to do the questions within the time frame allotted. So which is why we hand them off over to Slack, which stays persistent between our presentations and between logging in and logging out, where Zoom loses all that. So with that, without further ado, then let me go ahead and introduce John Livingston. So John is from Verve, and he's going to be speaking to us about the forgotten OT and ICS endpoints. So John, all yours.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate it. Can you all hear me okay? Sound all right?
Yep, sounds great on my end.
Terrific, terrific. Well, thanks everybody, and a series of great discussions here so far today. Excited to hear what's coming after mine as well. So I'm here to talk about as I mentioned, the forgotten endpoints. We spent a lot of time talking about networks in an ICS and OT. We're going to spend some time in this session talking about the endpoints themselves. Just by way of introduction, I'm the CEO of Verve Industrial. Prior to joining Verve about 5 years ago, I spent about 20 years of my career with McKinsey & Company, helping industrial companies on their digital transformations and that sort of thing. And then joined into the world of security to try and protect those digital transformations. In terms of who we are as Verve, we've been in the business of industrial controls for almost 30 years now. Began as a control system engineering firm back then. And then about 15 years ago, as NERC-CIP was launched here in the United States, built the first version of what we call the Verve Security Center, which essentially brings kind of a comprehensive, and we'll talk more about that as we go, but essentially a comprehensive platform to enable ICS OT security. And then also as a firm, we provide a range of services that go along with that, leveraging our history as control system engineers and both on the automation side, but then most of our business today is specifically focused around designing and remediating and hardening those systems from a security standpoint. So with that, we'll dive into what's been going on. So I know this same story has been told a lot, so we won't spend a lot of time on the status, but obviously the last few months, really during 2020 and the beginning of 2021 has seen quite a large increase in the amount of attacks. And I think Moritz in the last discussion highlighted a large reason for this is the hacking community has discovered that this is a profitable enterprise. And as a result of that has driven a significant increase in the amount of ransomware, particularly in the industrial environment. And so what was kind of something you could track on a pretty regular basis and see, okay, there's a big attack here, et cetera, really over the last 18 months has become much more significant. And so those energy and manufacturing have now moved, and this is some data from IBM, have moved from 8th and 9th respectively for manufacturing energy up to 2nd and 3rd in terms of the most targeted industries. And so this is just creating an even greater need and focus around the world of OT or ICS cybersecurity. So what are we seeing going forward? We've come up with this acronym called Air Raid that breaks down where we see some of the, I guess, the trends moving and what that may mean for how we think of protecting these systems. As I mentioned, the attackers, it's becoming a much greater attack focus for quote unquote commercial hackers. So we're not just worried about nation states taking down the grid now, we're worried about our evil and others going after it from a monetary perspective. IT, so IT's leadership is moving much greater into the OT and ICS world. We're seeing pretty much, 60–70%, I would say, of the organizations we see IT is now becoming the driver, or the CISO is becoming the driver of the security agenda, even across the OT world. And as we mentioned in one of the articles that we put into the chat, even when we think about Colonial Pipeline, an IT attack has potentially massive implications on the operational side of a business. So again, IT and OT really coming together in that sense. The regulatory environment is changing dramatically. We see this TSA pipeline as kind of the first stage of what is likely going to be a much more rigorous compliance framework, requiring actions, what we refer to as sort of a NERC-CIP light approach, which will require more active defense, more auditable proof of security. The resource constraint is obviously significant, but as the number of vulnerabilities grow, right, 50, 60% increases year over year in the ICS side of things, it's just become overwhelming from a resource ability to handle this, and certainly to try and do it on a site-by-site basis is becoming almost impossible. Alert fatigue. So a lot of folks have tried to put in some form of detection capability, and what we hear regularly is, I'm overwhelmed, and my only response at this point is just to shut down, and that can't be the right answer in every case. Insurers are also becoming a much bigger player in the ICS space. The quote unquote hard cybersecurity market, meaning prices going up, and also has meant that insurers are now digging deeper into what you've got going on in your ICS security. And they want to see the same kind of demonstration of security as they're seeing in IT. And so again, there's an expectation now that your OT security will have the same kind of security capabilities as you've had in IT security. And then finally, directors. As a result of all of these things, directors are really becoming much more focused on the OT side of things. And so these trends we see starting to drive a change of questions being asked around what is the baseline security. One that we hear frequently is, are we making any progress? So great, I'm detecting alerts. Is that good? Is it bad? Are we getting better? Are we not? Can we demonstrate that we're taking these actions? In other words, can we somehow prove that we've done some of these things, et cetera? And so that raises a set of requirements of what we need to do to secure these systems. So the first is, what we're seeing is be able to demonstrate progress in risk reduction. So don't just tell me I've got an inventory. Great, I got visibility. I know what I have. That's terrific. But I need to be able to audit how that is moving over time. I need to be able to see moving from quote unquote red to green on my overall risk. I need to be able to ensure that those protections that we say we're using, whether it be a firewall that's protecting the system, and I think Robin's going to talk about his platform that helps there, or users and accounts are managed, and we don't have dormant users on those systems. Patches are applied, or alternatively, there's some compensating control in place for that patch not being deployed. So being able to demonstrate how we're becoming more secure, moving from red to green. The second piece we're seeing is moving from alerts, which are helpful, but frankly are only the first part of the problem, to actual accelerated response. So being able to get more intelligent alerts. So I want to see a broader set of telemetry. I don't think we would protect our IT systems with just network information, right? We want to have an endpoint. We want to have detection information from those devices, processes that are running, et cetera. We don't want to just monitor. We got to find some way to act. We got to find a way to quickly respond to those risks. And the answer can't always be, okay, we'll just shut it down and we'll figure it out. What we call least disruptive response. And then finally, increase efficiency, sorry. So there's just not enough bodies to do this. And so what we refer to as think global, act local, meaning we got to find some way to aggregate this information centrally, but then ensure that the actions that we take have the oversight of quote unquote local or people who understand that particular process. And so these are the things that we are seeing are the requirements of where we're going to need to go in the world of ICS security. And so as we look at this, it has to get beyond network detection and protection. This is back to the point of the forgotten endpoint, right? We spend a lot of time talking about network protections, whether those be firewalls, network monitoring, et cetera, which is all good. But at the end of the day, we have to find a way to get to those endpoints. We need to find a way to have what we refer to as 360-degree view of your risk. So it's great we know vulnerabilities. It's terrific we got CVE. Yes, absolutely, we need that. But in addition to that, there's a ton of software on these systems that frankly shouldn't be there. We don't need DVD burners. We don't need log me in. The number of times we go in and put in Verve and we discover that people have got iTunes on their control systems. It's like, oh, no, it shouldn't be there. And we know it shouldn't, but it's there because they're not monitored. The endpoints aren't being monitored for applications that aren't communicating. AV status, are we up to date? Are we not up to date? Do our backups up to date? Everybody says, oh yeah, we have backups. Okay, are they up to date? Is that endpoint for sure up to date? So there's a 360-degree view of the risk. Then there's proactive endpoint and network protection. So everybody says, oh, well, you can't patch in OT or whatever. Yeah, it's hard, but it's definitely doable. And so how do we prioritize those patches in a way that we can actually deploy them? And how do we then deploy them in a scalable way that's safe for the OT environment? We need to be able to harden configuration settings. We need to be able to remove users and accounts that shouldn't be there. Network segmentation, obviously. So all of these things to actually protect. But again, that gets down to actually managing on endpoint. On the telemetry side, right? Getting to the endpoint to get that endpoint information, whether it be Windows log, user behavior at the endpoint, processes on the endpoint, AV alerts from the endpoint, all into a comprehensive telemetry. So we're not just reliant on the network side. And then, as I mentioned before, least disruptive response. So being able to identify what are the paths, and then how do I take an action at that endpoint that is the most targeted way to respond to any particular threat. And then finally, on the recovery side, being able to know we can recover and we have that endpoint information to do so. Look, we recognize that there are a whole bunch of challenges to doing this, from OEM diversity. There's a lot of confusion on the risks of managing these systems. Having done this for 30 years, and actually being control system engineers, we kind of know what you can and you can't do, but there's just a lot of FUD about, oh, well, you just can't manage these systems. And in fact, you can, so there's this confusion to get over. There's obviously, operational views of it, just don't mess with it, it's working, don't touch it, et cetera. And so we recognize those, and what we've done is to build a platform that deals with those challenges, but allows organizations to apply that endpoint security, what we call OT systems management, within an OT environment that's safe and effective for OT, but that allows you to do the same kind of things you're used to doing in IT security. Everybody's going to say, it's all about asset inventory, and it is. It is all about asset inventory. But that asset inventory, to really do security, you have to have visibility down into the asset, not just what's communicating, but actually to know every piece of software, all of the accounts, et cetera. So that does start with that asset inventory, but then what Verve allows you to do is to essentially have applications around that asset inventory. So vulnerability management, critical. The prior folks in threat quotient were talking about that, right? No one would disagree. We need vulnerability management. But then we also need to be able to actually fix it. We need to be able to patch. So the ability to bring patch management, vendor agnostic, whether it be an Emerson system or a Honeywell or whatever, but to have that integrated patch management across your estate. Configuration management. so often these systems are not managed by any sort of AD infrastructure. And so the configurations are all over the map. So the ability to then understand, are we insecure based on our configurations, and then go in and harden that through the platform, then take those actions to harden it. Similarly with users and accounts, identifying all of the users and accounts, not just those that are on the wire, but every dormant account, every dormant user, password status, et cetera. Those are the risks that we need to take into account. As we go around here, the ability to do integrate anti-malware information, an intrusion detection platform that isn't just network information, but integrates that endpoint data with the network data, so that we can start to build real understanding of what's going on when we have a potential threat. And then finally, as I mentioned, incident response, to be able to identify where that threat can go and then take an action on the endpoint to protect that endpoint specifically. And we'll talk more as we go here about that. So how does that come to life? Well, as I mentioned, visibility is key. And so by going at the endpoint, several advantages. Number one, I don't need to put in all the spans and taps and all that other infrastructure to see the endpoints, right? I can get to them without having to put in the very, very expensive infrastructure that might be required if I was just trying to do that off the network. I can do that in a way that's flexible. So I can get that information. I don't need to disrupt Purdue models to get it. It can all be essentially flowing outward from the network. And then it gets obviously very, very deep into the assets. So you can see all the way down to everything from cards in a PLC backplane, serially connected devices to an RTAC, plus information from other tools like AV tools, whitelisting tools, et cetera. And so that is really the foundation of being able to get the information. And then once we have that information, we can provide a 360-degree view of the risk of that asset. And so obviously it starts with the inventory and the vulnerabilities. But as we know, and the patch status, but as we know, we can't just patch every vulnerability. And so we need to think about all of the risks in an integrated way. Okay, is it securely configured or not? Does it have insecure accounts, lots of passwords, shared accounts? What's my AV status on that system? Is it up to date? Is it not? Do I have network protections in front of that? Do I have firewalls? By the way, are those firewalls properly configured? Do I have a backup for that system? What's the criticality of it? How important is that system versus another? And by bringing all this data together into that platform, we can start to put a risk score to an asset, right? Everybody says, oh, you need compensating controls. Okay, yeah, I need that. How do I measure that? How do I know that my compensating controls are in place? If the way I'm going to protect from that patch, from not patching that system, is I'm going to harden a config, okay, is that config hardened or not? If I've got two systems that are equally unpatched, how do I know which one to go after first? Well, certainly it'd be an asset criticality, but maybe one has antivirus, and that antivirus is up to date. It's got application whitelisting. It's behind a firewall. Well, that should have a different score and a different priority than a device with the exact same patches, but doesn't have those compensating controls. And by having all that data in the same place, you can make those trade-offs. And the only way to do that is to actually get to the endpoint to get that information back. Similarly, as we get down into that, and I know one of the questions was, okay, can you show how these tools work? And so this is some examples of the kinds of data that come out of this, right? Is to be able to get down and to see every single patch that is missing on every single system, right? So one of the big challenges that we have if we don't get to the endpoint is actually knowing true patch status. We may see an OS version on the wire, but unless we get to that endpoint, it's hard to really know, is a patch been deployed or not? And so one of the things that Verve does by getting that is to be able to provide detailed information of every patch that's missing. Which patch is it? What vulnerability does it relate to, et cetera. And then when you actually find a vulnerability and you patch it, you immediately know that it's been patched. I don't have to wait to scan it with some new vulnerability management tool. I know that immediately. And then I can prioritize it or organize it based on type of system, like the bottom left of, is it the turbine controls? Is it the security system, boiler controls, et cetera? So that's on the patching side, but also, as I mentioned, on the user and the access rights. So being able to identify how many admin accounts do I have that don't have the right passwords, that have expired passwords, or frankly, maybe have default passwords. How many administrator accounts are on each of these hosts? Do I have a lot of inactive accounts? So one of the big risks is you get vendors who come in, they come through for an outage, and they leave these accounts. But because they're not tied to an AD infrastructure, they tend not to get cleaned up. And so by using Verve, where we're at the endpoint, we immediately see those, and we can quickly clean up those accounts that shouldn't be there, which are real risks, given the ability to find passwords, et cetera, on the dark web. And then beyond user and accounts, getting down into actual configurations. So being able to assess configurations against these devices, and we've got a few hundred compliance checks that we can do, which are all customizable. But to be able to get down, what you see here is all the various compliance checks and a percentage of devices that are compliant or not. And this is back to the green and red point, right? I need to be able to demonstrate that I'm making progress on my security. I need to have a baseline to start. Okay, how much red was I in? And am I being able to improve the security of my environment? Am I hardened from a configuration point of view in this case? And then as we get further into that, as you can think about the holistic set of risks to address in the endpoint, essentially what we're doing here is to be able to go at all of the various types of endpoint type risks and frankly network device risks, and to be able to address those and remediate them. So remove, if you've got shared passwords, let's get rid of those shared passwords, and we can go in and make those actions. We got dormant accounts. Okay, let's get rid of those dormant accounts that don't need to be there. One thing we always find where we're multiple NICs, and sometimes that makes sense, sometimes it's necessary, but a lot of times it's there because Joe needed remote access and that was the easy way of setting it up. We can identify that by looking at the endpoint for those NICs. Just some of the things that we can do to fault metrics in OT. So we've talked about risk reduction, but you have to be able to take actions to do that, right? And so one of the things about endpoint is you can see the risk action, and that could be patch management, it could be configuration hardening, et cetera. But because of the ability to get to the endpoint and actually manage the endpoint, we manage it. We don't just see it. We don't just know that there's a risk, but Verve allows you to then go remediate that risk in a way that's scalable and OT safe. So there's always an OT responsible person who's in the middle before that final action is taken. An OT person just to review it and hit execute. So we've talked a lot about the risk reduction part of this, but then how about the threat response, right? We talked about you have to reduce risks, but then you have to be able to do threat response. And so one of the things about getting to the endpoint is it allows you to do, what in the vernacular is XDR, meaning I can get multiple forms of telemetry, not just network forms. So I can get syslog, netflow, that sort of thing from the network, but I can also get all the configuration changes at the endpoint. I can get device metrics like, is the process, what's the processing going on? What's the CPU usage? What's the bandwidth usage? Obviously Windows logs, user behavior logs, firewall logs, AV and other logs, right? So we've got data coming out of our AV tools. Let's integrate that into the same telemetry path. let's also bring in, obviously, packet inspection type things into that. And then finally, we have physical processes. Let's monitor them. We already are monitoring them. And so what the Verve platform allows you to do is bring that data in as well. And so we're not limited by all we're going to look at is network. We can then get this endpoint data. And when we say endpoint, it's not just the endpoint in the sense of, okay, I know a log, but I can get alarm data, physical data off of that endpoint as well. And then that can go into a broader detection platform to create robust detections that tie these various types of telemetry together to give more intelligent detection in the OT landscape. But again, back to the point, right, we have to be able to respond. We can't just, great, we send off an alert, but how do we then respond? And one of the advantages of having that endpoint information is we can understand the context of that threat. We can go directly into the asset. So give me an example, we've got a pass the hash attack going on, certain accounts that we think are at risk. We can then go and immediately search within the platform for where are all of those accounts. And I can see, okay, great. Maybe the least disruptive action is I can remove those particular accounts that are under threat. And I don't have to shut down the whole system. I can go after a specific targeted action to remediate that. And I can remediate it right from the platform. That ability to go from the detection rapidly to the response significantly, improves the mean time to remediation and response. And so, as we showed before, there was those risk reduction measures, but then we add on the threat response, right? And so this ability that we have to go to the endpoint allows us to not just reduce risk, but also both improve as well as accelerate the ability to respond to potential threats. So obviously, you can't do this on a standalone, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, we have to find a way. IT is going to be deeply involved in this process. And so that OTSM platform, OT Systems Management Platform, has to integrate with the rest of the IT stack, so to speak. And so one of the keys to the platform that we built is very, very robust APIs and integrations, whether it be with Splunk on the SIM side or ServiceNow or Remedy on the CMDB side, or being able to integrate information from firewalls, bringing in, one of the big things is patch lists, right? Vendors only approve certain patches. And right now, many organizations sort of rely on, okay, Honeywell, they got their system and those approved patches, but I can't really view those with my Emerson approved patches or my Yokogawa approved patches. And so by using Verve, we can bring all those patch lists into one platform and see them all together. So a CISO can look not just at the patches that are required and the vulnerabilities, but can also see in a completely integrated way, what are those that have been approved for the different systems. So those are just some of the ways that the platform can integrate with various third-party tools. And so I mentioned at the beginning that one of the key requirements is to be able to scale, to be able to reduce cost of security. And so the way we think about this is what we call think global, act local. So the ability to scale up the information. So if you think about, I've got hundreds of plants. Many of our clients have, literally hundreds and hundreds of plants all over the world, 600 different sites. All of that data can be rolled up. Every endpoint gets rolled up to the top. I can see 100% of those assets. I can see their vulnerabilities. I can see the users. I can get all the log data, et cetera, all up into a single platform and do that analysis, do my planning centrally, and then distribute those actions that I want to take in playbook form down to the plants. And then before those actions get taken, I can put the control in the plant for those ICS operators to review those actions before they hit go. And that ability to both have local control over it, but centralizing essentially the security analysis allows us to drive a substantial reduction in labor requirements by about 70%, because I'm not having to have security experts spread all over the world. And so what have we seen to be the benefits of this sort of endpoint network approach to OT systems management? So the first is, as I mentioned, better risk management. So the ability to have a more complete asset and risk view to do that 360-degree scoring, taking into account compensating controls, et cetera. I can protect, not just detect. So I can integrate all of those protection mechanisms, patching, configuration hardening, software management, user and account management, et cetera. And so I can get to green, so to speak, move from red to green faster. And then I can demonstrate that. I can show how to my board, to insurers, to regulators, whoever it is, I can demonstrate how we're making progress. From a detection point of view, because of the multiple forms of telemetry, one can get just better detections as a result of that. I can respond more quickly and more targeted. I can scale, so I don't have to put in all the infrastructure necessary that might be necessary to get full-on view if I was going to do a network approach. And then that platform, that think global, act local can drive lower labor costs. And then finally, OT safe, right? It allows that analysis to get scaled, but ensures that ICS expertise is involved. And then obviously our team has had, like I said, 30 years of experience in these control systems, and so can help. But even more than that, the ability to get that insight into those ICS devices really helps from an operational point of view too, because now there's visibility at a plant level as to how their devices are actually performing and what's causing potential disruptions. So this is what we see as kind of some of the key advantages or benefits of actually getting there to the endpoint, not to mention the fact that there's just a driving need to have more IT type security engaged in the OT environment. And so, typically what we see when folks get started, and this is going to be an eye chart, we'll distribute this, but basically that we go from some form of an assessment period through remediation onto maintenance over time. Probably won't spend much time on that. That'll get shared to the group. It's just too small to read. But the key to that is bringing that IT team and the OT team together, right? I know we talk about this IT versus OT. We don't like that. I think the idea of OIT is probably an interesting term. We can all debate what the right terminology is, but to have these groups working together from day one is key if we're going to be able to really get to those endpoints, which we're, in our view, very likely going to need to do. So with that, I think I'll draw to a close here. I think I've hit my 30-minute mark pretty well. Justin, I'll throw it back to you here as we end on our slide with just what's the benefit, what's the progress that one can get from this. And really appreciate the opportunity to be with everybody today and such a great, huge community. It's terrific.
Thank you very much. No, definitely appreciated the presentation and very informative. So it doesn't look like we have any questions popped up for you yet. We actually have 2 or 3 minutes. Is there any final words you want to offer for us in that last 2 or 3 minutes before we go ahead and move on to the next speaker?
Yeah, no, I just would end with this, which is that, the ability to track improvement over time, we just believe is going to be critical as we get into, the various requirements that are coming forward. And so Verve allows you to demonstrate that sort of red to green, so to speak, I keep saying.
No,
So,
definitely.
Thank you very much, everyone.